We bring in Professor David Monyae. He's an associate professor of political science and international relations at the University of Johannesburg and the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies. Prof, thank you so much for your time. I mean, we continue then to analyze this particular election in the view and from a backdrop of what it means for South Africa, for the African continent as a whole. I mean, countries with economic and trade ties to the US like us are no doubt closely watching the outcome, and a lot of suggestions that a Kamala Harris victory would likely then maintain, of course, the Joe Biden era in terms of the policies, while Donald Trump could shift focus towards the U.S. economy. But we've seen this happen in his presidency before. Just your observations on this front.
I think when you look at the two parties, both Democrats and Republicans, there isn't much difference when it comes to foreign policy. But I largely agree with the view that Harris will be a continuation of a Biden administration, where there's so much talk about democracy and the like, but tangibly nothing happening in terms of the relationship. I think we've seen with Biden, with all the promises he made towards Africa, it's only now at the 11th hour on his way out of White House, he's now visiting Angola. I mean, very symbolic, nothing substantive. Doesn't take, the Democrats do not take Africa that serious. However, they tend to be portraying a message that they're so close to the continent. When it comes to Trump is in a different league. There are views across the African continent that this is a racist man, given what he did in his last administration. However, I think most Africans prefer Trump, not for reasons that are good, but just is a racist that will leave the continent alone. I think that in itself is much better than having friends that pretend to be close to the continent yet doing nothing. So I wouldn't say much in terms of changes. Both parties have more or less a similar foreign policy.
Just from a domestic perspective, and when we look at, just some of the narrative and the rhetoric they were pushing during their campaigning, the differences at a glance. You had a Trump who spoke about, a broad tariffs across the board, immigration lockdown, sweeping tariffs. And then you've got a Harris who says she'll give middle-class tax relief, bigger tax credits for parents, small business loans, et cetera, and of course, a minimum wage. Domestically, how do these messages resonate with Americans, given just some of the dynamics domestically in that country?
I think, if you look at domestically, I think the economy is the core issue. I think one of the greatest weaknesses of Democrats, and Harris in particular, with all the support she gets from the media, I think the media has been much more favoring Harris and the Democrats this time around. The question of abortion, it's quite a huge issue with women. But one should not underestimate the role of conservative, the role of religion, and some within Black community, for instance, within America itself. So it's not really given that the huge number, 10 out of women, 54% vis-a-vis the 44% for men, that all women are voting for Harris. It's not given. The economy tends to take a much more lead. If we go back to Clinton era and so many other elections in the United States. The Democrats and Harris has been also very weak when it comes to the question of explaining the economy in terms of what she did, the inflation question, which is very high, and more importantly, the border issue, which is that gives Trump an advantage given the unhappiness of a majority of Americans when it comes to the question of immigration. However, she has done extremely well when it comes to, given the fact she had a very short time of campaigning given that the fact that Biden had to stop at a very critical juncture.
Yeah, and just talking about immigration and how Trump is promising to actually go harder in terms of his policies to what we've seen in the past. What would this mean, particularly when you look at the borders surrounding America, just from an international relations perspective? What are we likely then to see?
We're going to see more or less similar chaos with Trump's first administration. I mean, you remember when he came into power, it was anti-Muslim countries on the African continent. I think Sudan was targeted, and quite a number of countries that were targeted. However, it was just chaos. Even now, I think to really uproot millions of illegal immigrants in America, I think it would be, firstly, the United States does not have the capacity. It will have a huge impact, negative impact on the American economy, given that the fact that most immigrants are doing work and some are involved in small business. So it is going to bring a lot of tension, not just internally, but within the region, impacting Latin America mostly, and Africa, given the fact that some Africans will be really deported back to their countries, but in a very chaotic, really bringing in the isolation of the United States further.
And irrespective of, or rather, just the dynamics of the U.S. relation with South Africa, given South Africa's own, foreign policy and the relationship that we've seen in the last couple of years, particularly its stance on the war in Russia and Ukraine, its stance on what's happening in the Middle East, the ICJ stance as well. How likely are we to see that dynamic change between South Africa and the US, whether we have a Trump re-election or a Harris win?
I think the United States is increasingly being isolated. The global south is strengthening, but countries such as South Africa will be at the receiving end. But it is not only South Africa. I think you're seeing other countries that are standing up, maintaining their independent foreign policy, such as Malaysia, countries such as Turkey, Egypt. I think they're going to have this backlash, especially if Trump wins. But with Harris, it's more or less the same, the Biden continuity of Biden. A lot of rhetorics, a lot of threats on AGOA. I think there will be, but at the same time, there was also opportunity for more trade, more refined way of communicating and bringing back bilateral exchanges and try to really have clear understanding in terms of where South Africa stands. But the bulk of the work is to come from Pretoria, not Washington, in terms of explaining both to South Africans and Americans what South Africa stands for. I do not think that it should be business as usual, where South Africa bend backwards all the time and threaten over their AGOA. So I think it's a question of developing a win-win relationship with Washington.
Prof, continue then to unpack just how South Africa should start shifting or at least cementing its foreign policy on the broader implications of these elections, irrespective of a Harris or Trump win. I mean, as Kaya also said, just the implications of what this country also stands for and how we are also, going through several changes. And also given that this country is largely export-driven.
United States is a very important country. It is the economy number one. It also plays a critical role in a number of international forums. Multilateralism, I think it's a leading country on science and technology. And it's a country that has a very excellent relationship with South Africa and the African continent. And I think it is within that context that a win-win relation need to be established. However, there are areas where there are frictions at international level. One is to do with endless wars on the African continent, in which United States pays no attention to, whether it's in Congo, Eastern Congo, whether in Sudan, and a number of forgotten conflicts that are central to the development of the African continent. The resolution of those conflicts is central to the development of the African continent. But I think visibly at these major wars, one in Ukraine as well as in Palestine, where United States is a leading country in the world, plays a very contradictory roles. On one hand, it's against Russia in terms of its special military operation in Ukraine. On the other hand, it gives a blind eye to Israel that appears to be committing a genocide in Palestine. So these are some of the issues in which South Africa stood for principles, human rights, and took Israel to ICJ. So I think dealing with these issues, it's an important issue for South Africa, and South Africa cannot do it alone. South Africa has to work with SADC, it's to work with the AU, and engage United States, whoever comes into White House on these critical issues to avoid United States pushing its weight around and commanding South Africa to follow its suit on these issues at a global level.
Yeah, and just looking at the implications of these particular elections, I mean, they are very closely tied in terms of just what the kind of tight race that this presents for the USA. And when we look at, how democracy, of course, needs to kind of breed from just accepting who the final outcome will be. We've seen in 2020, of course, how the tight race led to violence, subsequently January 6th. What do you read then in terms of, the possible concerns around safety and security should, a possibility be that, Trump does not become the favorable candidate here and the presidency goes to Harris, considering that it is a close race? We saw, of course, what happened in 2020. Nobody wants to see a repeat of that.
Oh, indeed. I think this is at the heart of the entire question of democracy and the traditional view that we look at Washington as a lead in terms of a champion of democracy. I think that view is coming to an end. It's now time for the United States to learn from South Africa and other emerging markets and emerging countries to learn how to conduct elections, to learn and change some of the tradition within the U.S. democracy itself. For instance, the so-called electoral college, it's an old system that is not in line with modern democracy. And therefore, I think with time, we're going to see a demand coming from Americans themselves in terms of reform of their own democracy. But we stand concerned with the events on the ground and chances of violence. But I think it's violence that will be contained. The United States military police force is quite formidable. It will be able to withstand the pressure from the ground. But instability, it's a much more a threat to instability in the United States will have a huge impact on the global market, as well as other democracies, whether in Europe and other parts of Latin America, as well as Asia. And therefore, we all waiting anxiously to see an end to these elections and a peaceful transition should there be a change of power in the United States.